Kalen pressed his palm against the cold, crystalline wall of the megastructure, feeling the faint thrum of ancient power beneath his glove. The air tasted of ozone and decay, a cocktail that had become familiar over the past 3 cycles. Ahead, the corridor stretched into darkness, its bioluminescent veins long since extinguished by the passage of eons. His team had moved through this tomb for weeks, uncovering relics of a civilization so advanced they made humanity look like children playing with fire. And now, they had found it, the core. "Anything, Doctor?" The voice of Sergeant Vex crackled in Kalen's ear, her usual sarcasm replaced by an edge of unease. Even the hardened soldiers were rattled by the silence, the sheer weight of the dead around them. Kalen adjusted his helmet, the visor flickering as it struggled to translate the alien glyphs etched into the walls. The translations were gibberish, nonsensical strings of symbols that defied all linguistic models. It was as if the ancients had spoken in a language that broke the universe's rules. "I think we're close," Kalen murmured, stepping forward. The ground beneath him trembled, not from an external force, but from within. The megastructure was waking, or something inside it was. The glyphs began to glow, pulsing with a sickly green light. Kalen froze as the air thickened, the silence replaced by a low hum that vibrated in his bones. The ancients were not gone. They were waiting. The hum grew louder, a physical pressure that made Kalen's teeth ache. Vex and her team raised their rifles, barrels trembling as they scanned the darkness. "Contact," she barked, her voice tight. "I don't see anything." Kalen knew better. The ancients weren't visible. They were here, in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of the structure. He reached into his pack, pulling out a device humming with unstable energy, a resonance emitter designed to disrupt biomechanical systems. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "Fire it on my mark," Kalen ordered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The emitter pulsed in his grip, its blue light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The glyphs flared in response, the hum rising to a deafening roar. Then, the walls moved. Not like shifting rock, but like flesh. Biomechanical tendrils, slick and black, erupted from the crystalline surface, lashing out with impossible speed. Vex's squad opened fire, their rounds tearing through the tendrils, but more kept coming, a tide of impossible flesh. "Mark," Kalen shouted, slamming the emitter against the wall. The device detonated in a blinding flash of blue light, and for a moment, the tendrils recoiled. But the relief was short-lived. The hum didn't stop, it intensified, and the walls began to crack. From the fissures, something emerged. Not tendrils this time, but eyes. Dozens of them, glowing with malevolent intelligence. The ancients were not just awake. They were angry. The eyes swirled in the darkness, countless and ancient, their gaze locking onto Kalen and his team. Vex's squad fired again, but the bullets passed through the apparitions as if they were smoke. "They're not physical," one of the soldiers yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Kalen knew they were outgunned, outmatched, but retreat wasn't an option. The emitter had done something. It had angered the ancients. Now they had to fight back, and their only weapon was one the ancients couldn't comprehend: irrationality. "Fall back to the core chamber," Kalen ordered, grabbing Vex's arm and pulling her toward the corridor ahead. The tendrils lashed at them, narrowly missing as they sprinted. The air grew colder, the hum louder, until it felt like his skull was about to split open. The eyes followed them, their glow intensifying, and Kalen realized with dawning horror that they weren't just attacking. They were communicating. The glyphs on the walls were shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense, yet somehow felt threatening. "We have to disrupt them again," Kalen panted, skidding to a halt at the entrance to the core chamber. The room was vast, a cathedral of crystalline spires that stretched into darkness. At its center, a pulsating orb of pure energy hummed with ancient power. The ancients were converging on it, their tendrils and eyes coalescing around the orb like worshippers. Kalen knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight them, but he could confuse them. "Give me all your remaining power cells," he told Vex, his voice resolute. She hesitated only a moment before handing them over. Kalen jury-rigged the cells to his emitter, overloading it until it glowed with blinding intensity. "This is going to hurt," he muttered, then hurled it into the core. The emitter struck the orb with a force that shook the entire megastructure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the light from the core exploded outward, a wave of pure energy that tore through the tendrils and eyes, dissolving them into nothing. The hum stopped. The silence returned, absolute and deafening. Kalen and his team stood panting, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They had done it. They had stopped the ancients. But the celebration was short-lived. The core orb pulsed once more, then split open, revealing a cavity within. Inside, something moved. Not a tendril, not an eye, but something else. Something organic, yet mechanical, ancient yet impossibly alive. It rose from the core, a being of shifting metal and flesh, its form defying all logic. The glyphs on the walls flared, and Kalen's helmet translator finally caught something. A word, sharp and alien, that cut through the silence. Thar. Vex's squad raised their rifles, but Kalen held up a hand. Don't shoot, he said, his voice trembling. The being before them was the ancient's leader, and it was speaking, not in glyphs, but in words. Words that made no sense, yet somehow did. Kalen felt his mind reeling, the language twisting around his thoughts like a serpent. The ancients weren't just attacking, they were inviting him in. Thar extended a limb, not a tendril, but something more like a hand, though it was made of interlocking plates of obsidian and pulsating veins. The gesture was unmistakable. Come. Vex grabbed Kalen's arm, her grip tight. Don't do it, document. It's a trap. But Kalen couldn't look away. The being before him was the key to everything. The ancients, the megastructure, the language that defied translation. It was irrational, yes, but so was the urge to step off a cliff and hope you could fly. He took a step forward. The moment Kalen's foot crossed the threshold, the world dissolved. Not in a flash of light, but in a slow, creeping shift. The crystalline walls melted into liquid, the air thickened to the consistency of gel, and Kthar's form rippled, stretching into something vast and unknowable. Kalen's helmet flickered, the translator spitting out nonsense syllables that somehow formed a coherent thought. You are not of us. You are not of the pattern. The pattern. That was what the ancients called their reality, their language, their existence. And Kalen, with his chaotic, irrational human mind, was an anomaly. Kthar was studying him, probing his thoughts, and Kalen could feel the ancient being's confusion, its frustration. It couldn't understand him, and that fear, that irrational fear, was the only weapon he had left. The pressure in Kalen's skull became unbearable, as if Kthar were trying to force its way into his mind. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the one thing that made him human, the absurdity of his situation. Here he was, a scientist from a backwater planet, standing in the heart of an ancient megastructure, facing a being that defied all comprehension. And he was winning, because Kthar couldn't grasp the concept of defiance. Why do you resist? The thought slammed into Kalen's mind, not in words, but in pure, unfiltered meaning. You are insignificant. You are temporary. You are wrong. Kalen laughed, a sound that echoed in the liquid-like air. Wrong? He thought back, projecting his own defiance into the void. Maybe, but at least I'm alive. Kthar recoiled, as if the concept of life, messy, unpredictable, irrational life, were a physical blow. The being's form wavered, the obsidian plates cracking, the veins pulsing erratically. It had encountered logic, it had encountered power, but it had never encountered bravery. Not the calculated bravery of soldiers, but the raw, unthinking bravery of a creature that would stare into the abyss and spit in its eye. Kthar's rage was palpable, a storm of alien fury that shook the very foundations of the megastructure. The liquid air churned, the crystalline walls groaned, and Kalen felt his mind being stretched to its limit. The being was trying to break him, to reduce him to the same gibberish as its language, but Kalen held firm. He focused on the one thing Kthar couldn't comprehend, hope. Not the hope of victory, but the hope of trying. You cannot win, Kthar projected, its voice a chorus of shrieking metal and tearing flesh. You are a mistake. A flaw in the pattern. Kalen smiled, the gesture feeling alien even to himself. Then I'll be the biggest mistake you've ever made. With a roar, Kthar lunged, not with tendrils or eyes, but with its entire being. The impact sent Kalen flying, his armor cracking, his body screaming in pain. But even as he lay broken on the ground, he laughed. Because Kthar had made a mistake. It had focused on him, on the insignificant human, while the rest of the megastructure began to stir. The ancients were awakening, not to attack, but to watch. And in their watching, Kalen saw his chance. Kalen dragged himself to his feet, ignoring the blood trickling from his wounds. Kthar loomed over him, its form a vortex of rage and confusion. The ancients were silent, their eyes fixed on the two of them, on the human who refused to break. Kalen knew he couldn't defeat Kthar alone, but he didn't have to. He just had to make the ancients see. "You think I'm a mistake?" Kalen shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. "I'm proof. Proof that the pattern isn't perfect. Proof that there's more to existence than your cold, dead logic." He slammed his fist against the ground, the impact sending shockwaves through the megastructure. The ancients' eyes flared, their confusion deepening. They had never encountered defiance like this, defiance that wasn't strategic, but emotional. Kthar struck again, but this time, Kalen was ready. He dove aside, rolling toward the core orb, which pulsed with renewed energy. The ancients were watching now, their attention divided between Kthar and the human who dared to challenge it. Kalen reached the orb, placing his hands against its surface. The energy surged through him, a torrent of ancient power that threatened to tear him apart. But he held on, focusing not on fighting back, but on communicating. Not with words, but with feeling. The energy from the core orb burned through Kalen's body, but he didn't let go. He poured every ounce of his being into it, his fear, his anger, his hope, his irrational belief that he could make a difference. The ancients' eyes widened, their forms rippling with newfound understanding. They had never encountered emotion before, not like this. It was chaos, yes, but it was also life. Kthar roared, its rage reaching a fever pitch as it lunged for Kalen. But the ancients intervened. Their tendrils shot out, not to attack, but to restrain their leader. The being struggled, its confusion turning to panic as it realized what was happening. The humans had shown them something new, something they had never considered. Kalen felt the connection then, not just with the orb, but with the ancients themselves. They were learning, evolving, their rigid pattern beginning to bend around the chaotic, beautiful mess of human emotion. The megastructure trembled, not with destruction, but with rebirth. The air grew lighter, the walls solidified, and the hum softened into something almost like a sigh. Kalen collapsed, the energy from the core receding as the ancients released their hold on Kthar. The being stood before him, its form no longer a vortex of rage, but something calmer, more contemplative. The glyphs on the walls shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns, patterns that made sense, not just to Kalen's translator, but to his heart. "You are not a mistake," Kthar projected, its voice softer now, almost gentle. Asterisk, "You are a catalyst." A new note in the pattern. Asterisk, Kalen smiled, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. "Then play it loud." The ancients began to withdraw, their forms dissolving back into the walls, leaving Kalen alone with Kthar. The megastructure was still silent, but it was no longer hostile. It was alive. Kalen knew he couldn't stay, not forever. But he had done what no one else could. He had shown the ancients that there was more to existence than logic, more to life than perfection.